Okay, well, we are at the bottom of the hour. I'd like to welcome you again. My name is Rob Chaput. I'm your moderator today. Thank you again for joining today's session, Blue Ribbon panel event, entitled HIPAA Security Risk Analysis and Risk Management Do's and Don'ts. The landscape is littered with many lessons learned, and we hope to cover those today over the course of the event. Once again, it's my complete pleasure to welcome you here to what should be a very interesting session of learning and exploration and discussion together. That is the audience participation part of the program. For those of you who have just joined, I asked a couple of minutes ago and a few times as we were leading up to the event, please hijack this session, make this meeting yours by posing questions that are near and dear to your heart, rather than just listening to me go through. Wait a minute, we have a question here. It's okay, Kimberly. No apologies required. In any event, please hijack the session, pose questions that are relevant to you. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists today, and we'll do so in a moment. And for those who joined earlier, you saw their smiley faces scrolling across the screen. Our Blue Ribbon panel comprises more than 15 nationally known experts in HIPAA high-tech and more broadly, privacy, security, and regulatory compliance in general. And our plan is to conduct these live events monthly on the fourth Tuesday of the month. We're, I think, a month or a week off this time. And I'll also hasten to add, we decided to say school's out, we're taking the summer off, and we'll resume these sessions at the end of August. Meantime, back to today, I want to call your attention to the GoToWebinar control panel on your computer screens. Please use it to communicate during the event. I'll look for questions throughout the event, so please ask them at any time. In fact, if there's any sort of technical glitches or difficulties, I will use the chat area. So take a peek at that once in a while. Finally, I'd like to point out that there is no fee for this web event. We offer this educational discussion as a way to help covered entities and business associates raise their awareness of the requirements under HIPAA and high tech. And indeed, these are very serious legal subjects. Even though we have two real live attorneys online today, and even some people who probably stayed in the Holiday Inn Express, we are not practicing law. We encourage all of you to consult with competent inside and outside legal counsel. You will hear some of those competent people, but this session is not about practicing law. We are recording today's session, and barring any technical glitches, we'll post that within 96 hours of this event on our website, along with the few slides that I'll show to get things going, and we'll send you a message at that time. Whew, thanks again for joining us. Enough preamble, and let's get started. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce Faisal Naji. Faisal is the Executive Director at Tecumen, and just by way of a audio check, Faisal, if you'd like to say a couple of words of introduction, and I'd like to welcome you.
Hello, this is Faisal Nanji, and thank you for having me on, Bob. And I worked with Bob for a long time in many places, and have done a lot of risk assessments with Bob and without Bob either.
Very well, thank you very much. And Mr. Greg Ehart. Greg is from Idaho. Well, actually, I'm going down the wrong list. Let me turn over to my friend Kamal. We're looking at photographs, not my list. So, Kamal, if you would say a few words so we have an audio check and introduce yourself. We'd love you to do that.
Hey, Bob. Glad to be on this panel once again. Hello, everyone. I'm based here in Chicago and practice security and privacy risk management for a living, and glad to be here and look forward to a wonderful 95 minutes ahead.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Kamal. And John Christensen. John, I have to say we have never met in person. But we've met electronically, as happens today, and I'd like to welcome you to our Blue Ribbon panel in today's event. Would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob, and thank you all for being here today. It's true, you're one of the people that I have, quote-unquote, met many times in one way or another, but not physically, and I suspect that a fair number of people in the audience, the same thing applies. I'm a lawyer, have done more risk analyses and risk assessments than I care to think about, both as a lawyer and in a consulting capacity, and it continues to be a real challenge for all sizes and types of organization.
Thank you very much, John. We have good audio. I appreciate that. Next, I would like to ask my friend and fellow boot camp faculty member Greg Ehart to check in and say a few words.
Great, thanks, Bob. I'm excited to be here. Certainly welcome everyone. Grateful to have an opportunity to speak with you and look forward to talking about risk analysis and risk management.
Thank you, Greg. It sounds like you're in a much more quiet spot than you were
Much better
last
today, Bob.
Thanks for that. And my friend and colleague, Rick Cam from ID Experts. Rick, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to reach out to everybody and say my welcome. I look forward to having a productive session today, and let's go.
Okay, Rick, thank you very much. Well, I took the liberty to try to depict the fact that we have representation from East Coast to West Coast. We do need to work on representation from Alaska and Hawaii, and I know we have folks from those geographies on with us today. So I'm hoping we get a good cross-section of experience and insight as we dive into this matter of risk analysis and risk management. First, by way of a little bit of background around the Blue Ribbon panel, these folks who have volunteered their time, our gentlemen on today's panel, do so because they care very, very much about educating individuals and helping organizations become and remain compliant. And the core belief is captured in the quote at the bottom, which one of my panelists had said some time ago. The more that we have well-informed, experienced people communicating and talking about this subject matter openly, the more it's going to help others in the healthcare industry. So that's our mission. We are, as I alluded to in my introductory remarks, about 15 to 20 qualified experts from all over the U.S. We meet on a monthly basis, although I said we're going to take the summer off. We want to cover the things that are pertinent and germane to you. And as you exit today's session, there's a very brief, 8 or 10 second survey I would implore you to fill out. Give us some ideas on the value created today for you. Give us some ideas on future topics that you'd like to cover. Some of them are listed here. And again, why we want to help organizations become and remain compliant with these regulations. That's about playing defense. More importantly, for me, and I know many of my panelists join me in the following thinking, this is really about improving the quality of care, access to care, and timeliness of care. Until or unless you safeguard the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of PHI, you're going to be placing things we're trying to do in healthcare at risk. As I mentioned earlier, while you have some live, well-trained, and very deeply experienced attorneys online, we are not providing legal advice today. This is very dynamic subject matter, although with the omnibus final rule on Omnibus Day on September 23rd, we seem to be in a period of stabilization a little bit. And interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, like most things in life, when it comes to HIPAA high-tech, you can line up a panel of 5 or 6 experts and ask them what is a seemingly simple question and possibly get 12 different answers from those 6 people. I hope we see some of that difference of opinion and some of those dynamics in today's session, and I hope we hear it from you. If we say something at any point along the way that is contrary to your understanding or you believe to be flat out incorrect, well, please, by all means, pose a question in the question area and let's have it out and talk it through. A couple of questions, if I may, by way of some polls to help our panel have a sense of the audience we have online. Let me ask, what type of organization do you represent? I'm launching a poll. You should be able to simply hover over the appropriate answer on the screen and indicate whether you're a covered entity, a business associate, a hybrid entity. Classic example, it might be the pharmacy and your retail grocery store. It might be your big box friends at Costco or Sam's Club or BJ's that have declared healthcare components. So we'll take a second just to build this out. I mentioned earlier, this is the audience participation part of the program, along with the part where you pose questions. So we've got about 2/3 of the tally in. I will recognize the fact, even when I attend webinars, I multitask. So we have some multitaskers. Let's close the poll, share the results, and my panelists out there should be seeing the same data. Everyone should be seeing the same data that I do. We have Well, it's almost 50-50. We've got about half of our representatives today from covered entities, the balance from BAs and hybrids. So that's great to know and very helpful. Let me hide those results. I have another question for you as you enter into today's conversation. How do you feel your organization has done? Have you completed a bona fide HIPAA security risk analysis as required in the security rule at 45 CFR 164-308A12A, the risk analysis, and A12B, the risk management? How do you feel you've done in that regard? And I'll share that with our panelists as well. And what we're trying to do here, for those of you participating and attending, we're trying to get a sense of how to raise the subject or simplify the subject matter as we go through today's event. So if you'd be kind enough to do that, we're about at 2/3 of the tally is in right now. And we have, well, we're about 70%. I'll close it out and share the results. And similar to the representation, I wonder if there's correlation. We have about 55% feeling they have completed a bona fide legitimate risk analysis, and 45% either not sure or simply don't know. Okay, so let me hide those results and continue along here. This is the last polling, maybe the last polling question. I want you to look at each image that I place in front of you here, and if you want, jot down on a piece of paper an H for high, an M for medium, an L for low, or an N for no. In each of these images, how much risk do you see? And then at the end, I'm going to say, across all of these images, what's the maximum, the greatest amount of risk that you see? And I do this for the following reason. Let me just give you the backdrop. I have a point of view, some people call it an attitude, that states that the reason most organizations are not doing thorough bona fide risk analyses is that they don't really understand what risk is all about. So with this little exercise, I'd like to make a point of that, and then we'll proceed. So a bald tire, high, medium, low, or no risk. I've repurposed the bald tire into a tire tree swing in my backyard. High, medium, low, or no risk. I'm now showing you an image of a frayed rope. High, medium, low, or no risk. The next thing I've done is I've taken my tire tree swing and I've moved it to the north bank of the Rogue River in southern Oregon, great river. And as you look at that image, it's on a 200-foot precipice in the Rogue River below at various rapid levels. High, medium, low, or no risk. And then finally, I have a photograph, although my granddaughter has dark hair. I'm going to pretend for a moment it's my granddaughter enjoying the tire tree swing that I have in the backyard. High, medium, or low risk. All right. With that, I'm now going to ask you a question. And I think I'm going to ask you a question. Here I am. Oh, you may not have seen that. Oh, of course. And you're all yelling at me. Okay. Here we go. Let me back up. Here are the images. Bald tire, tire tree swing, frayed rope, tire tree swing over the Rogue River, and tire tree swing with a child on it. Sorry about that. Appreciate that, Marissa and Kimberly and Betsy. The question that I'm posing to you is, what is the greatest amount of risk that you see in any of those images? What's the greatest amount of risk that you see in any of those images? And here comes the polling question. Should be visible on your screen. High risk, medium risk, low risk, no risk. And I know we have some people who have attended some of my sessions before and know the answer to this. All right, we've got about 67, 2/3 of the vote in. We're coming around to 70%. We've got that last group of holdouts who are doing performance appraisals or email or something. And I'm going to call it quits. We're at about 75% of the tally is in. And so in response, I'm sharing the results, and I promise I will hide them after this poll. The majority of people, far and away, majority of people feel that there is high risk in one of those images. I'm going to guess based on previous experience with this, it might have been the image over the Rogue River. 14% think medium, 5% low, 5% no risk. So let me go back to this and make a couple of points. The answer is there's no risk. Until or unless you have the possibility of harm or loss, you have no risk. There is only one picture, one image where there is potentially the risk of harm or loss, and that's the one involving a quote-unquote asset. And the asset would be a child. We don't go around talking about our children or grandchildren that way. But we have a bald tire. You're making stuff up. The bald tire, who knows where it is? It's sitting in a junkyard. You might think it's on a car. It's a bald tire. In the scheme of risk analysis and risk management, this would be considered probably a weakness. At a certain point early in its life, it was probably an asset. The tire tree swing. What is the potential loss or harm with this tire tree swing? If the rope broke and it fell on the ground, who cares? Similarly, if the branch on this tree broke over the Rogue River and the bald tire went careening into the river, who cares? It's an old bald tire. No loss or harm. Frayed rope in the scheme of risk analysis and risk management is considered usually a weakness. It's a vulnerability. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the only possible chance of risk is the image where there's an asset involved. We'll say it over and again. This is my point of view. I'm going to invite my panelists to comment momentarily. There are some very important facts about risk, and that is until or unless you have an asset and a threat and a weakness, until you have a triple, you can have no risk. And if there is a low or no probability of that happening, the threat exploiting the vulnerability, you have no risk. And if there's no chance of adverse impact, you have no risk. So this is what we want to talk about today. In order to do a bona fide risk analysis, you need to understand what this is all about. There's one message a couple messages we want to leave, but here's one in case you've been on an interplanetary space mission for the last several months and missed the fact that left and right, as OCR has gone out and enforced the HIPAA security rule, organization after organization has been dinged, every single one of them, for not having done a legitimate risk analysis or a timely one. In the 2012 audits that were conducted by OCR, 115 organizations audited, 68% of them failed when it came to having completed a risk analysis, 80% of the providers. The upshot of that, this is relatively recent news, at the end of March, the Office for Civil Rights announced its focus in the Phase 2 audits, and as it relates to the security rule, absolutely unequivocally, for both covered entities and for business associates, it's going to be around risk analysis and risk management. A couple more slides to set the stage. At the end of the day, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So many people start solving without understanding what is the fundamental mission at hand. I would suggest to you it's depicted in this slide. I care about my protected health information. I'm sure you care about yours, and we all in healthcare should care about others' very personal, intimate information. When it comes to my PHI, I'm concerned about how it's shared, how it's used, with whom it may be disclosed, and what are the rules of engagement. In the scheme of privacy and security, that's known as confidentiality. The opposite of confidentiality is disclosure. In HIPAA parlance, impermissible disclosure. The other thing I care about when it comes to my PHI is that it's up to date, it's accurate. If indeed I'm going into surgery and somehow it indicates I'm allergic to penicillin and I'm not, or worst case, I have a certain blood type that I don't have, that could amount to a life or death matter. That's about the integrity of that information. And finally, in the scheme of everybody moving into the electronic world and the notion of a nationwide health information network, just love that vision. God forbid I present myself in an emergency room, the doc goes ticky, ticky, ticky. attempts to bring up my full lifelong longitudinal health record and gets page 404, not found. That's a matter of availability. And at the end of the day, the problem we're trying to solve when we do a risk analysis is to find all the possible ways in which the confidentiality or the integrity or the availability can be compromised so we can make informed decisions and implement reasonable and appropriate controls to prevent that. Because of a great amount of fear, uncertainty, doubt, misinformation that existed for a while, HHS and OCR published this document in January of 2010, July, 2010, and said, this is what a risk analysis is all about. That document is 9-page PDF, rather nondescript, and fundamentally, here's what it states. We don't care whose risk analysis methodology you use. It needs to include these 9 essential elements. It needs to be comprehensive in scope. Sorry, doc, it's not just about the newly implemented EMR system. It's about the practice management system and email and anything else that creates, receives, maintains, or transmits BHI. You need to collect information about those assets and document them, create a catalog. For each asset, you need to consider unique threats and unique vulnerabilities. The laptop with PHI, threat, maybe stolen, vulnerability, no encryption. That is a triple that needs to be analyzed from a risk analysis point of view. Laptop with PHI, I'm sitting in Starbucks, I'm a home health nurse. Shoulder surfer is the threat, vulnerability, no privacy screen. That's another triple. One last one, laptop, plugged in at home, no surge protection, lightning strike, fries the electronic components, causes a hard drive failure. The threat is a lightning strike. The vulnerability is no data backup. Yet again, another triple. You need to consider all those. You need to then consider what good things you may have done. Once you have a triple and you've considered the controls you've put in place, you need to look at the likelihood of the bad thing happening, were it to happen, the impact, determine a level of risk, document it, and then periodically review and update it. This is the guidance HHS and OCR has put out. They're agnostic to methodology. It can be based on NIST. It can be based on ISO. It can be based on the Carnegie Mellon approach called Octave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, that's the stage I wanted to set. I'm going to go to the question area. And other than you all creating and letting me know that we didn't have the pictures up there, what questions do you have? I'm going to open up the dialogue by posing a question. I'll make it a jump ball initially. Is risk analysis, the thing that I've just been speaking about, required at 45 CFR 16430A12A, the same thing as a security evaluation also required in the security rule? In fact, I won't make it a jump ball. Hey, John, let me ask your thoughts. Risk analysis the same as a security evaluation?
I don't think so. I think the security evaluation is kind of more narrowly focused, if you will, more process and IT focused. I think the risk analysis, really you need to step back a bit and look in particular at the overall, the portions of the regulations where they tell you the factors you are allowed to consider and need to consider in deciding what your strategies are, because your risk analysis really is intended to support your overall risk management strategy.
Yep.
And that's where you're allowed and in fact directed to consider, factors, not only the threats and vulnerabilities, but what resources you have, what resources you can obtain. Part of the point is not to bankrupt organizations, forcing them to get perfect security, which of course doesn't exist. But I think the point is to force them to do an analysis of what their potential exposures are, or the potential exposures, frankly, for the information and therefore affecting other people, so that they can put that under appropriate management. And the evaluation is then sort of a more technically focused portion of that overall strategic review that you need to be doing.
Thanks, John. Hey, Kamal, you've done more of a few of each of a risk analysis and a security evaluation. What are your thoughts?
Sure, Bob. So in my speak, if you will, I really consider security evaluation as HIPAA security rule puts out to be nothing more than what I call as controls assessment. So in other words, HIPAA security rule, as we know, has a definite set of required implementation specifications or requirements. Maybe quite may not be quite correct in terms of which word it is that HIPAA security rule uses. And then there are certain other addressable implementation specifications, right, as we know. So security evaluation is all about looking at those specific prescriptive set of required and addressable specifications and seeing as to how your organization is doing against those specific, prescribed controls, so to speak. Okay. On the other hand, risk analysis is really more of a open exercise in many respects, right? Because you as Bob pointed out on that slide, we need to consider all the valuable assets we have, certainly in the context of HIPAA security rule. We need to consider all the assets that handle PHI or APHI and see as to how the current state of threats and vulnerabilities would impact those assets and cause potential risks based on a number of factors. And in many ways, the risk analysis exercise could be getting a lot more complicated than a straightforward security evaluation because whether we like it or not, the threat environment keeps evolving all the time, and as we keep reading in the news these days, the hackers and people who want to be malicious in nature are always more innovative than we can ever catch up with them, right? So I think risk analysis is certainly an open exercise, as I said earlier on, and it tends to be more difficult and certainly would help if you got some expertise involved in doing risk analysis.
Thank you, Kamal. Hey, Greg, you have the distinction, and perhaps others online do as well, but you have the distinction of having met face-to-face and worked with the investigators from the Office for Civil Rights. Would they say a security risk analysis is the same as a security evaluation?
They would not. I've actually had that question and answer session with them, fortunately for me, I guess. They look at it, at least the ones that I've spoken with, say that the risk analysis really isn't necessarily related to HIPAA. Of course, it's necessary within the world of HIPAA, but it's looking at the risks and vulnerabilities. That security evaluation they look at to be both a technical and a non-technical. And for those of you who may be students of corrective action plans and perhaps even been aware of Idaho State University and their breach, they were specifically called out for a gap analysis. And that's thrown a lot of people what that means and where that comes from. But that gap analysis is part of that security evaluation and is part of that non-technical testing, making sure that your policies and procedures line up and that you're doing the things that you indicate you're doing and testing that regularly.
Very good. Let me move on to another question. In fact, Susan, who's online, has posed it. Great. Thank you, Susan. We'll hopefully get the pump primed. Susan writes, I'm a consultant and work with several medical clients. I have found a huge, capitalized, I bet if she could bold it, she would have, range of depth and detail in each different security risk analysis. It seems that if you follow the complete meaningful use security risk analysis final rule, which contain a large amount of HIPAA omnibus rule, there shouldn't be a variance between each risk analysis. And what is the correct documentation? Can an eligible provider, an EP, get by with a minimal SRA? Faisal, you've had, I know, lots of experience in large and small organizations, but I know specifically you've worked with a lot of medical practices. What should there be a large amount of variance in these things?
Thank you, Bob. In general, the question is a philosophy. The philosophy is that there should not be variance. But of course, if you're looking at a very large a hospital versus a small single doctor practice, there are obviously differences in how you approach the risk. But the philosophy is the same. And I think one of your earlier panelists hit it right on, in which he said or he implied that the risk analysis, the security evaluation is a subset of the overall risk analysis. So by definition, if you're doing the risk analysis, you are doing a security evaluation, whether it's administrative controls, technical controls, or physical controls. But at the same time, there might be other risks that you might uncover. For example, the lack of good financial controls. But that's not the intent, of course, of the HIPAA security rule. So what I am here to suggest is that any risk analysis follows the same approach, and that's why I think the NIST standards are pretty awesome. In fact, I think that's one thing the government has done right. They've done a lot of things right, but the NIST standards and the NIST approaches for risk evaluation are very comprehensive, very concrete, and they provide guidance for all kinds of sizes of practices. So we do, single doctor practices, two doctor practices, to academic medical centers, and we take the same approach. Obviously, we're spending more time with the larger academic medical centers because there are more assets to identify, there are more potential data flows, and so the complexity increases significantly. But the philosophy should be the same. And really, the 9-step process that NIST has identified is right on. I think it's a really good approach, and thank you to the United States government for doing that for us.
And I'd just like to quickly jump in on that one, Bob, which is that the one thing you have to say about NIST is it would be very hard for OCR to disagree with you using that as a resource, since that's the guidance that applies to federal agencies. So yep. they have to follow it in principle themselves. So it's hard for them to disagree with you if you do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I just wanted to add another plug for the government. We give the government a lot of crap as citizens of this country, but this is a great government. We've done the right things, especially NIST does a very, very good set of right things. So we should all give them a hand of applause.
Well, very good. Hey, Rick, I want to swing back to the West Coast here, and we often get questions from individuals about risk analysis versus risk management or risk treatment. I know you do a lot of work with lots of healthcare organizations. How would you advise people? What would be your summary to differentiate risk analysis from risk management?
Well, that's a big question, Bob. Well, I don't know if I can answer that in an
hour. Do your best.
Yeah. Well, maybe a way to approach that, because I know you have different sized and different levels of sophistication in terms of organizations on your session today. And I was trying to think how to address, in particular, the organizations that may not have the resources to do an appropriate risk analysis. And so one way I was thinking about this was, I think Faisal was mentioning that there are a lot of great resources like NIST that our federal government has provided for us all to look at. One in particular I wanted to mention to the audience that I thought would be helpful is the security risk analysis, although they call it the security risk assessment tool. That's available on the HHS website. And as I looked at it, relative to some of the things that we do relative to risk assessment, risk management with our clients, it provides a very basic introductory tool, or introduction and a tool for small to medium-sized organizations to look at what the administrative, technical, and physical safeguards are necessary to complete a simple risk assessment. So as I was just looking at some of the guidance, and just to provide a little levity to the conversation, it turns out if you can't answer the first one or two questions on the assessment or on the guide, you probably need help with this particular process. And I'm imagining Bob, you'll pull pull a copy of this up, but the net of it is it goes very quickly into whether or not an organization has done the appropriate steps to develop, document, and implement policies and procedures for assessing their risk around electronic health information. And so you get very quickly into some very complex subjects. But again, if you're starting from zero, starting with the user's guide and then working your way through a few of the documents where they ask you questions about administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, may be a good way to step into an analysis and help you understand the difference between those safeguards and then what you need to do in general with risk management.
Very well. I have a question that came in from Debbie on where do we find these guidelines? A couple of things, Debbie. One, the slide deck that I will make available because others have asked about that, and we'll publish that along with a recorded version of this event. So that slide that had the OCR HHS guidance that came out in July 2010 has a link in it. The other thing I'll do is send out a page with links to all the underlying documents in the NIST security framework. So be aware of that. I want to just go back and see if anyone else has a comment. Rick mentioned the tool that was put out jointly by the Office of the National Coordinator, as well as I think OCR. They teamed up together to put that out, and it was published, gosh, within the last 60 days. Anyone else have any thoughts or comments on that they'd like to make?
This is John, and speaking as a lawyer, and as somebody who's been following the Snowden revelations, I recommend against filling that out online.
And and why is that, John? How do you?
I don't know where the data goes, and I don't think it's privileged.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts on the government security risk analysis, so-called SRA tool? All right. Let me move to a question posed by Cindy. Hey, Cindy, long time. It is. Any thoughts on HITRUST versus NIST?
Can I take that one?
You just did.
All right. I think HITRUST is the boondoggle for the Big Four. And again, I don't mince words, as you know, Bob. I think HITRUST is absolutely abysmal. It takes way too long a time, and it doesn't allow you repeatable process. So that's my 2 cents on HITRUST. I would recommend nobody use HITRUST.
Well, that's a point of view. Anyone have a counterpoint on HITRUST?
This is Kamal. I'm not sure I have a counterpoint to that, but in some ways I would agree with what Faisal just said. HITRUST at the end of the day is not a really new framework. It really is a consolidation of various security frameworks and regulatory requirements from a variety of regulations, including HIPAA security rule. So that being the case, if you're really trying to evaluate yourself against all HITRUST requirements, you can imagine as to how difficult that exercise is going to be, right? Because people have difficulty in using just one framework. Let's say it's 800-53 from NIST, right? And HITRUST actually blows up that list of requirements manyfold from there. So just by the definition alone, using HITRUST is going to involve and require a lot of resources. And I'm not sure in this day and age, and certainly in healthcare, anyone has the resources to do that. So,
and I'd like to add, Bob, it's I'm going to bash HITRUST until the cows come home, because I think it's misplaced. It's misplaced concreteness. I think you spend a lot of time trying to understand what your assets are, and then by the time you understand your risk, you really haven't had the time or the resource to actually manage that risk. So I am totally against HITRUST. That's why I like the NIST framework, because it allows you to be very flexible depending on the size of organization you have.
And I would also like to add that HITRUST is been traditionally a security framework. It has not, at least in my opinion, had a lot of focus from a risk management standpoint. And unless somebody can prove me wrong, it was only last year, I believe it was July or August of 2013, that they even came up with a risk analysis, guide for high trust. So, that being the case, I'd like to ask if using high trust, certainly it's a very comprehensive framework, but the question is, does it really help you manage risk in a meaningful and a viable manner? Yeah. My own observation is that it does not.
I'll just opine here. I'm trying to be an independent moderator, but I will say to anyone that's evaluating any methodologies, frameworks, or tools, ultimately, if you do a legitimate risk analysis, the quintessential output, the key output is something called a risk register or a risk rating report. And as you examine what comes out of high trust or what comes out of the NIST, the ONC OCR tool or any other tool, make sure you produce a risk register report. And I'll leave on that note. I want to ask this question that just came in. Let me see, I'm navigating back to my slides here. Have you ever had OCR review your risk analysis output? And if so, how did they react? Greg, I happen to know that you've been through that swallowing of fire and walking on broken glass. Can you speak about that?
I'd be happy to. I was thinking that one's for me, Bob. I'm sure of it. You're exactly right. It's not a secret that Idaho State teamed up with Clearwater, with Bob and Mary and their wonderful staff. We have been through that process before. We have gone, and I have spoken directly with OCR, both in person and certainly on the telephone a number of times. We've analyzed the tool that Clearwater has produced, and we've gone through that thoroughly with the objectives and all the different controls that are within there, and they felt very comfortable. In fact, it went through very quickly. Just a little bit of background, Idaho State University, before my arrival, I was brought in to assist them throughout this process, the investigation, and to try to get a settlement that was something of reasonable to be able to do so for a state-run university. And we had performed, prior to my arrival, there was a risk analysis that had been performed and was sent in originally to the OCR for their review and hopefully approval. And surprisingly, while they didn't necessarily come out and reject that, they did suggest to us that that was not comprehensive, not nearly as comprehensive as it should be. And so in essence, they rejected it because they simply didn't accept it. And of course, Clearwater was brought in, and we've been through that process, Bob, and it was a very positive experience for us.
I want to ask if anyone else, John, I know you've worked with clients and have done a lot of risk analysis. For the person that posed this question, people are looking for the right way to go and how discriminating OCR has or has not been. Let me bat it over to you. Have you been through that process with OCR?
Yeah, though in my role as a lawyer and not as the client, I feel a little bit constrained in what I can say. I do think there is sometimes what I would perceive as a little bit of unreality about what is possible for some clients in some settings. What that means in practical terms, however, is that in most cases, I guess I would say organizations aren't being as comprehensive and thoroughgoing as OCR actually expects them to be. Mm-hmm. And so this whole set of processes is time consuming. It would be paper intensive if you didn't put it all in electronics. And it involves activities that people would prefer not to be doing, like sitting in small rooms, reviewing policies and talking to each other on nice days. So, there's a tendency to say, okay, what can I get by with? I tend to say, okay, you've got, at one end of the spectrum, you've got quote unquote mere compliance. Okay, we've checklisted, we've got something or other here, and we'll figure that if we've got something or other, that's okay, as opposed to actual risk management, which is where you in fact go through a pretty intensive process of identifying risks and vulnerabilities and actually, coming up with solutions that are meaningful in your actual environment. That really is ultimately probably better for the organization. Again, with the caveats that I think I've heard here, especially about high trust and not overloading your process, because if your assessment process is overloaded, you may never get to risk management. But having said that, I think the expectation is you will be thorough, and therefore I think presenting more, and in particular presenting more documentation probably than some folks would like to have to develop. That is always helpful. Yeah. My goal is always to, when OCR comes visiting or anybody like that, I would like to sit them in a nice room with a view with all the coffee they would like to drink and boxes of things to look at so that they will look at all the documents and be very happy, I hope.
Yes, understand. Rick, let me swing this next question over to you. Thank you, John and Greg. The question comes from Kevin, and it indicates, do you or anyone on the panel incorporate a vulnerability assessment / pen test as part of your security risk assessment process? If no, why not?
I guess I would, just to start the conversation, depending on the type of organization, they probably do have networks, and they do have systems that exist that they use, either that they own or that they may contract with, whether it's a cloud service provider or an ISP or some other variation on the theme. So unfortunately, the answer depends on the complexity and the types of assets the organization has. Mm-hmm. But a pen test will typically be employed if you have some of these assets and you want to be assured that they're operating correctly to secure your electronic PHI.
Yeah. Hey, Kamal, how do you position vulnerability assessments, pen tests, social engineering, other network testing vis-a-vis risk analysis?
Sure. So, in my opinion, I think if you're really talking about assessing a particular technology solution, I think we need to take the context into account, right? And by context, I mean whether the electronic health record, let's say, is the application that we're talking about, whether it is accessible only internally within the organization, and assuming that it is an on-premise application as opposed to cloud-hosted or an ASP-hosted. Now, on the other hand, if you're talking about, let's say, a patient portal application that's available for access outside via the internet. So if you're looking at these two different examples, I would say in both cases, if I were to be asked to do a risk analysis, I would certainly do minimally vulnerability scan or vulnerability assessment, because that will tell you from a technology standpoint if the application has certain unknown vulnerabilities, right? On the other hand, the penetration testing, I'm sure people understand the difference between a vulnerability scan and a penetration test, but a penetration test is really more extensive in nature and scope as well. And it usually involves engaging people that are specialists in their profession. Takes a lot of planning, both from a scoping standpoint as well as from the execution standpoint, and therefore is not usually employed, at least as frequently as vulnerability scans are employed, or done. But in the event that you have an application that is, that's got a very prominent exposure, I would certainly look at doing penetration tests, but one must always consider the fact that penetration tests are not trivial exercises. They involve a lot of planning, resources, and potentially even costs. So,
okay. Anyone else on the differentiation between, or the inclusion, is the way the question was posed, of technical testing? I'll use that generically to describe what Kevin asked, as part of security risk analysis.
Yeah, I'd just like to add something, Bob. And one of the things I don't think end users of software applications really do well is they don't request or don't demand of their software providers that they have done appropriate and adequate risk assessments on their software. And I would urge anybody on this call who is a buyer of software to ask their providers if they have done adequate security testing. And this is especially true, as Kamal mentioned, for patient portals. I know for a fact I stopped a patient portal from going online for a large academic medical center because I knew they had not yet completed their security risk assessment, yet they were claiming that it was safe. But, you know, how can you do that when you know that 80% of your vulnerabilities are in code? Mm-hmm. So I would strongly urge people to press on their vendors to make sure that they can provide you with some kind of certification or some kind of proof that they have done adequate security testing on their application, and especially web-based applications.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to add, and then I'll go on to another question. So Kevin, I brought this slide up a moment ago. Here's how we break it out. We think about when it comes to, you know, frankly, this would apply in any industry that had regulatory requirements. We think about this matter of security business risk management as including answering the question, are we compliant with the regulations? And that really gets to the matter of the security evaluation. Are we secure? That gets to the matter of risk analysis and risk management. And then where we place the pen testing, vulnerability scans, social engineering testing, et cetera, is in this third category, test and audit. So we regard it as part of an overall security business risk management program, but not, you know, to split and make it a fine point. It's not exactly a risk analysis. Pen testing, vulnerability scans, all those great things are about validating the efficacy of the controls that you've put in place. Kimberly poses, I think it cycles back to the question I asked about risk analysis and risk management. Kimberly said, could you say that a risk analysis is from a bottom-up approach to review your risk, and the risk management is a top-level approach to explaining your risk? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is how I tend to think of it, though I'm not sure I'd put it exactly that way. I think risk analysis does absolutely require, you know, the bringing up of information from the ground level, from the grassroots level. You need to know accurately what it is you have out there and what's going on out there in order to make judgment calls, you know, in order to decide what the risks actually are. And then somebody with authority and accountability needs to decide then, okay, so what are we going to do about those risks that we've identified based on that information that percolates up? Sort of, I tend to draw it in a pyramid where you're drawing from a broad base down below, and at sort of the mid-level, you start, you know, categorizing and making your risk determinations, saying, okay, this is a big exposure here, not so big there, that sort of thing. And then once you've sort of made a more than a rough cut on your risk determinations, then it gets bumped up for a decision as to what you do with those various risks. Some maybe you can accept, some maybe you can't accept, and you need to budget to do something about it, or authorize significant changes, or, as in the example before, maybe avoid the risk because you don't know enough your risks, as in the case of that patient portal I think that was mentioned. And somebody senior, you know, would have had to say, you're right, I'm being told we don't know the risks there and they could be substantial, so for now we're just not going to do that. So I think that kind of direction comes from above and the information comes from below. So I think that's accurate.
Yep. Anyone else on that difference? I will move on to another question, but I would simply add in response to that one, the difference. We look at risk analysis as finding out all those exposed potential ways in which confidentiality, integrity, availability can be compromised. And then once you know them, you have a risk register. Risk management, also known as risk treatment, also known as risk response, is about making informed decisions. Do I accept the risk? Do I avoid the risk? Do I mitigate the risk? And or do I transfer the risk? So one is about finding the exposures. The other is about making informed decisions as to what to do. Noelana, if I'm pronouncing that correct, has asked the question, does NIST have a tool specific to HIPAA assessment of an entity? And I'm going to infer HIPAA risk analysis in that question. Does NIST have a tool specific for a HIPAA risk assessment? Anyone?
Hey, Bob. I think they, if I recall correctly, they did come out with some tool probably around 2-3 years ago. I think they had a vendor prepare one for them. I'm not entirely sure if it's still available for download. I haven't seen it, for a couple of years, so I don't quite know where it is at this point in time.
Yeah. There was a cross-reference that was published. I don't recall that they ever actually did a tool, but I think the cross-reference was between HIPAA security requirements and NIST resources. Does that? That's just what I'm getting.
Yeah, there are actually a couple of things. John, perhaps what you're referring to is NIST Special Publication 800-66, which does a crosswalk from the HIPAA security rule, all the standards and implementation specs, into the compendium of all these NIST documents. So if you looked at the requirement around risk analysis in this book, 800-66, it will point to 800-30, 837, 839, etc. So at a high level, that's a document I think everyone should have a look at, 800-66. And Kamal, that's my recollection as well. NIST went out in conjunction with the Office for Civil Rights, had a tool built, but it was more akin to a compliance assessment than it was a bona fide risk analysis based on my experience with it.
Yeah, Bob, I think you're right. I don't think it was a risk analysis tool. It's really more of a security evaluation or a compliance or controls assessment tool.
Yeah. Let's see. So Andrew asked a question. Do you, and maybe I'll generalize it, does one check for encryption in doing a risk analysis?
You better.
Well, elaborate.
I mean, seriously, there are two standards that require, that are addressable specifications for encryption for data at rest and data in transmission. What that means is that where you have data at rest or data being transmitted, there's basically a presumption that you will be encrypting that unless you can analyze the situation and conclude that that's not an appropriate safeguard in that environment, and you have more appropriate safeguards in place otherwise, and that has to be documented. So you definitely in the first instance need to be saying where ought we to be implementing encryption, and then you should be looking at that and saying, okay, well, if we aren't, why aren't we? Can we justify that, and have we documented that? And I guess I would add a third step, which is, okay, if you have determined that you are encrypting where you should be, are you encrypting it to a level sufficient to get you the benefit of the breach notification safe harbor, which handily is, if you follow certain NIST guidance in encryption, that gets you a presumption that whatever that data is, it's not unsecured protected health information. So if there's possibly unauthorized access, it's still not a breach. So that last step isn't actually required under the security rule, but from a broader risk management perspective, I would definitely take that extra step.
Yeah. I'd like to add that encryption is certainly good, but I do think it does got its place. It's certainly not panacea. It's for example, it makes sense certainly to encrypt anything that goes outside of your organization, right? Goes outside of your physical limits, if you will. I'm talking about things such as laptops that may contain PHI, removable media, and things of that nature. Clearly, if you don't want them to be stolen and lost, if you will. On the other hand, if you're really looking to expand encryption of things such as databases, certain repositories that may reside on servers and things of that nature, I think you need to think about encryption from a holistic standpoint, right? Just because you encrypt something on a server or on a storage, let's say a storage area network that resides within your network, it doesn't necessarily get you the benefit that you want to get. For example, if a hacker were to get into your server that has encrypted file share containing, let's say, a number of files or even a database containing PHI, if the hacker got hold of, let's say, the administrator credentials to that server, he, in any event, can access the PHI files, regardless of whether the files are encrypted or not, right? So, I guess what I want to say here is encryption is good, but it's got its place. It's certainly useful in certain situations, but it's not. I don't think it's useful in all situations.
I would certainly echo that. Encryption is a control. Typically falls into a family called access controls and is designed, among other things, to ensure there's not a compromise of confidentiality, but it's certainly not a panacea. It's not a one-size-fits-all, exactly as Kamal had indicated. By the way, Susan did send in, thank you, Susan, the link to the tool that NIST put out some number of years ago, and I've placed that link in the chat area. So I would, again, just simply say, as you look at the matter of doing a risk analysis, you've got to be talking about assets, you've got to be talking about threats, you've got to be talking about vulnerabilities, you've got to be talking about controls. You then need to. Risk is not something you can observe in nature, like the bald tire and the tire tree swing, even the version hanging over the Rogue River. Risk is effectively a computed value. Think about it as speed is a function of distance divided by time. You need several variables to come into it. So as you look at these tools, if you're not seeing words like assets, threats, vulnerabilities, controls, likelihood, impact, I would proceed with caution in terms of it meeting the risk analysis requirement. So let me ask.
This is Rick.
Yeah.
Add one more thing to.
Please go ahead, Rick.
One of the other panelists mentioned anything outside the organization should be considered for encryption, and I believe that to be a solid and good statement. One of the other things that your audience may want to also look at where the multitude or the multitude. Somebody calling their dog. But anyway, when we were in a session in Anaheim, California, a couple of months ago, Joan McNabb, who's I believe the Assistant Attorney General for California, got up and talked about where when they did an analysis of data breaches in healthcare over the last year or two, I believe, where they were seeing the most vulnerabilities, the most exposure was with assets that were in offices that were typically physically secure. So a desktop perhaps, or something that was thought to be secure within the physical confines of an organization, where most of the high impact data breaches occurred in California over the last year. So as you look at ways, things to secure or vulnerabilities in your own environment, one place to look is also at some of the reports that are coming out from whether it's California Attorney General's office or Verizon data breach incident reports, or any of these research organizations that are looking at data breach statistics. One insight may be where these breaches are happening.
Yeah. I think that's great insight, Rick, and appreciate that. One of the things I'll swing back to Greg for this one. So, Greg, you have swallowed fire, walked on broken glass, and gone through the whole process with OCR. At the end of the day, do you believe that driving towards a more mature risk analysis and risk management process is it reduced information security risk in your environment?
I would say that's definitely true, Bob. We just being more aware, and certainly you have to change the paradigm in the organization to really make some headway. And when you're fortunate enough, and I say that with a lot of hesitation, of course, when you're fortunate enough to experience a breach, it really raises the level of anxiety, and you start to react, and you react fairly quickly. And what's happened is we were overreacting for quite a period of time there. It was trying to bring them back down into reality, but what it's done for us is it's made us better today. While we're not perfect at Idaho State, that university I would recommend or suggest at least is one of the strongest universities that I know of around the United States. It's raised our awareness. It's made us more involved. As Mary, your wife, puts it from time to time, the C-suite, we reach them. We're able to reach all levels, down to the very lowest to the highest. We're able to reach people, and they're able to react, and we're not overreacting as much anymore. We're certainly aware, and we're doing much better in these areas because of the risk analysis and the subsequent risk management.
Thank you. Anyone else that, just a comment on, so this is great. You know, there's a lot of emphasis on it. It's going to be the focus of the 2014 and probably 2015 audits by OCR. There'll be 400 of them, 350 covered entities, 50 business associates. And so at the end of the day, one has to answer the question, so what? Is it making a difference today in terms of safeguarding PHI? And if it's too early to tell, are you optimistic or not? Anyone have thoughts on that?
You know, I would say one more thing, Bob, not to interject, but you know, when patients learn of a breach, or when people around the community learn of a breach, there's always a lot of concern, and they want to know that their records are being cared for, and they want to know that their information is not being inappropriately leaked to people who shouldn't have access. And what that's done for us is it's allowed Idaho State to go back to those patients within those communities that utilize their services and remind them and certainly let them know with no hesitancy that things are much better. Because at the end of the day, and you mentioned this at the beginning, it's really all about protecting patients and their data. And that certainly that process has helped Idaho State move along that very line.
Well, and I guess I'd chime in terms of business associates, which is where I do an awful lot of work with IT vendors who are business associates in one form or another. And frankly, for them, their business model has got to be based on trust, as in their clients have got to trust that if they use my client, they're not going to be subject to being put up on the wall of shame. Or losing the trust of their patients or plan members or what have you. So what I'm seeing certainly among my IT services clients is a lot more attention to not only are we secure, but are we demonstrably secure? Can we do we have documentation? Do we have an independent assessment that we can show people? Because number one, we certainly don't want to have a breach or other negative event. But number two, can we bring something to the table in advance that will help us actually close the transaction and get the client?
Yeah. So I have a question from, thank you, John. I have a question from Greg. If I conduct or review a security risk analysis in accordance with, and Greg is matching me citation by citation, 45 CFR 164-308A1, and actually it's A12A, including addressing the encryption and security of data stored in a certified EHR technology environment in accordance with the requirements under 164.312A. Right. He's referring to the two specs that you mentioned, John, about encryption. So let me see. Will this satisfy the HIPAA requirements? So I'm going to just offer this up. Greg, lots of confusion, meaningful use, in the stage 1 objectives, core objective number 14 or 15 respectively, and stage 2 core objective, whatever, 13 or 14. There's been a lot of behavior acting as if this was like a new requirement, when indeed, as you pointed out, it's simply a citation back over, or a pointer back over to the HIPAA security rule. So I would turn that around personally. I'll ask others for their comment. I would complete my risk analysis in accordance with what's required under the HIPAA security rule, because that's where meaningful use points. And I would say my punchline would be, yes, you're going to be satisfying HIPAA requirements first and foremost, and meaningful use as well. Kamal?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I really think the change in stage to meaningful use that introduced the data at rest encryption for electronic health records was, at least from my standpoint, totally unnecessary, because they're not asking you to do it anyway, right? I mean, just emphasizing the need for you to take another look at it, look at the possibility of encrypting it, but I'm not sure that a lot of organizations are in a position to do that. So in any event, HIPAA security rule, Bob, as you pointed out, has always required, for people to take a look at whether it is reasonable and required for somebody to encrypt it, considering the risk involved. So to me, that stage 2 meaningful use wording around encryption has only resulted in confusion and not really anything useful. So.
Anyone else care to talk about this intersection with the meaningful use and EHR incentive program and HIPAA? Otherwise, I'll go to a new question. Okay. Go ahead.
This is Rick. One topic that is somewhat related to that, but we didn't bring up on this particular Blue Ribbon panel, was that if an organization is found to be not following all of the appropriate rules, and they attest to the fact that they've done a risk assessment, they've done the appropriate pieces of the puzzle to qualify for meaningful use incentives, that could create some significant potential legal problems for the organization if they do have a breach, or if if it's discovered that they have actually not followed meaningful use requirements, and unfortunately made an attestation that they had done all of these activities like risk analysis.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you kind of a related question. When we have this crop up from time to time, someone asserts, I did the risk analysis on my new EHR system or on my new EMR system. Am I done? Is that enough?
Well, you're never really done. You've done it now. You have your, slice of your processes snapshot of where you are. You are required to periodically reevaluate. The schedule isn't specified, but you certainly should know that if you have a material change to your operating environment, to your systems, then you need to be, well, it's simply good practice, and I think at least implied by the security rule, that you should be taking risks and vulnerabilities into account before you implement material changes. But at the very least, you need to be doing that, once you've got your changes implemented.
Yep.
And as to periodic review, anybody who doesn't think that you have drift in organizational processes and in what's in your systems and whether or not your systems are current on everything they need to be current on, just isn't being realistic about even what happens even in relatively small organizations. This is a lather, rinse, repeat situation, and so once you've done it, you need to be aware of the need to keep an eye on things, and be ready to review again on some defined appropriate basis.
Yeah. Well, John, I think you make a great point, and I agree 1,000%. It's not a once and done because of all the dynamics that exist in any organization internally, not to mention the external dynamics around threats and vulnerabilities changing. I think the heart of the question was around if I come to the table looking at this from a meaningful use attestation perspective and simply do the risk analysis on my EMR and nothing else, is that enough?
I think from a meaningful use standpoint, I think the jury is still out. I don't think we ever got a good answer from anyone for that. But you might be okay from a meaningful use attestation standpoint. But again, if you're considering the HIPAA security rule compliance, HIPAA security rule, as we know, applies to the holistic EPHI environment, if you will, not just the electronic health records. So,
it's interesting. In the security rule, under the security evaluation requirement, it talks about performing that work, quote unquote, periodically. Under risk analysis, it doesn't even use the word periodically, although in the 2012 audit protocol, that was one of the questions that was asked. Has this been updated periodically? So what does periodically mean? Go ahead.
I'll take that, Bob. Yeah, I'll take that, Bob. And this will be my last question, my last answer. But yeah, periodically means whenever your environment has changed significantly. That's my viewpoint. I mean, I've read through the security rule. I've read through the meaningful use requirements, and periodically to me just means that when you have a significant change, or when technology changed significantly, you have to do that. So for me, it seems to me that once a year is about the right amount of time, because either technology moves too fast within a year, or your own environment has changed within a year.
Yeah.
I generally recommend a year. I know we're not supposed to simply agree with other panelists, but that's my general recommendation too.
Well, no, but you and I have been agreeing the whole time. Is that John or is it Greg?
That's John, yes.
That's John.
Okay, John.
And Bob, I would say as well from the OCR perspective, and certainly not being able to speak for them, but my dealings and relationship with them, as I've gone back to them with Idaho State and other clients, a year is very much agreeable to them as well. Certainly if the environment changes, as has been spoken already by our panelists, that yes, you need to do a risk analysis and look at things quickly and assess, but if nothing has changed, it technically, is a year appropriate? Well, certainly from the OCR's perspective, they were very much in approval there as to in a year. They thought that was appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me do this. We're coming down the home stretch. I am going to look for any final questions from people who have joined us today. But let's start a round table here. John, if I can start with you, and then I'll go to you, Rick, and we'll work our way across the country. I'll go to Kamal and then to Faisal. If you had to just provide one or two things about risk analysis, risk management, do's or don'ts, what would you advise somebody today?
I think one of the key pieces of advice I would have is to try to get buy-off as far up into the C-suite as you can get. I've seen too many dysfunctional projects where basically it's somebody who doesn't have authority to really do what he or she is supposed to be doing, or is contemplated by the rule. I mean, not even in an ideal world, and doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the authority, and yet is charged with conducting this actually quite important activity on behalf of the organization, and then by default winds up making decisions as well that should be made higher up. So because you need to have, it's going back to the pyramid notion of, okay, the information percolates up from the bottom and the decisions come down from the top. It's crucial to be able to have that loop close itself, so that you have effective decisions made by people whose decisions are then, have the authority to implement them. And if there need to be budgeting decisions or operational arrangement decisions, strategic direction decisions conceivably, then those are being made by the appropriate people who can arrange for the budget and enforcement. So I think that becomes important. Yeah. I think making sure, the second thing would be making sure that you have the appropriate expertise on tap, because not everybody's good at everything, and it can seem like a cost saving, desirable from a cost saving perspective not to bring in somebody from the outside from the start. But if in fact you don't have in-house expertise in all the areas you'd need, you will not have an effective process. And I think you're much worse off if you do have that breach. For those of you who know Kirk Bailey and his assumption of breach approach to things, that's very much what I take. Assume you have been breached, and it will just be discovered a little bit later on. If that happens, then you're going to be explaining the record in hindsight and possibly to a hostile audience, and you would like it to look as if you had an effective process in place, because bad things happen even with effective processes in place. That's just life. We can't eliminate risk. We're living with risk.
Very well said. Thank you, John. Rick, what would be one or two do's or don'ts from your perspective?
I wanted to amplify a little bit on what John said. Is if you look at what the cost of responding to a breach is, and compare that to what the cost of having a risk assessment in place is, a risk assessment looks very inexpensive. In fact, besides being the right thing to do and something to do that you are required to do by various regulatory regimes, whether it's federal or state, assessment is a great value. So the first to do is build your own business case and contrast the cost of responding to a breach of whether it's 100 records or 1,000 records. Estimate what that cost might be, and then go out and get a quote for a third-party risk assessment to have it done so that you have an independent view of where the risks, vulnerabilities are if you don't have the in-house resources to get it done. And I guess the final thing I'd say is, on that point of getting it external versus internal, unless you have the expertise internally to do this, go out and get help. There's a lot of organizations that do this for a living, and again, it's something that needs to be done, has to be done, and there's a lot of organizations that can help with it. So those are two from me.
Rick, can you refresh my memory on what the link is to that ANSI document that we're both familiar with?
Yeah, it's www.ansi.org/PHI.
Okay, and I just want to pick up on the point that Rick made, ansi.org/PHI?
Yeah, PHI. So I'll find it and I'll see while you're talking.
All right, thanks very much. So we'll hang on to that thought and come back to it. Let me swing to Greg. Point number one, point number two, Greg, that you'd leave our attendees with.
You bet. Thanks, Bob. I would say that although it may seem rudimentary, I think the most important thing is to really know where your EPHI is located, and also to really know and appreciate your assets. I know you mentioned that at the beginning, but those are two things that are really critical. And when OCR came and started to question each of our directors of our clinics and others, those were some of the very first questions, is tell me where your EPHI is located and what are your assets, because without those it's very difficult, if not impossible, to perform a risk analysis and understand your threats and vulnerabilities. I would say to you as well, don't underestimate technical skills required to perform this risk analysis. These are not easy, they are very technical, and I would echo the sentiments that have been expressed previously, and that is, if you're not confident with your internal department, certainly seek outside help to perform those.
Very well. Kamal, what would be your top one or two? Or
yeah, I probably have just one, Bob. So from my standpoint, I think when I like to, when I work with my clients on risk analysis, I always emphasize that I think the intent that you have in mind is extremely important because intent, as we know, obviously translates into results, good or bad, right? So I think when it comes to risk analysis, I always recommend that one doesn't look at risk analysis as a compliance obligation. On the other hand, we really want to think of it as an exercise that has got immediate repercussions on really two things, right? The first one being the patient privacy or the patient safety, if you will. The second thing is, you're really in the business of, when you're doing risk analysis, you really want to identify all the risks that your organization faces currently or can face in the future, so that you're able to identify those risks and implement appropriate safeguards to protect your organization. So really, if the intent that you have in mind is around those two things, the patient safety and privacy and protecting your organization, I think you would do the right thing. On the other hand, if you really look at it as another audit or compliance exercise, we almost always do not do it right, and therefore the results will show accordingly. So I strongly recommend that that we have the right intent in doing risk analysis.
Terrific, thank you. And by the way, Rick, thanks. As you were sending this in, Tom was sending it as well. So what I'm doing, everyone, is posting in the chat area the link to, this should go to everyone. It's webstore.ansi.org/PHI. And the title of the document is The Financial Impact of Breach Protected Health Information. To a point that Rick made earlier, and I love the point that John did, that this has got to be placed as high in the organization as possible. This is not an IT problem. I'd probably say that 12 times a week, if not more. It's a business risk management problem, and it is becoming just increasingly more so. Our panelist, Faisal, had to exit early.
No, I'm still here, Bob.
Oh,
I'm still here.
Oh, you lied,
no.
Ben. You told me you left.
I know I did. I came back. I was always here.
Okay.
I was just checking to see if you were reading your little notes that I was sending.
Oh, you were testing me. Okay. Well,
Absolutely.
Faisal, what would be your one or two?
Well, I really wanted to focus on the more concrete and practical aspects of stuff that I see that I think people should really be aware of. One is to make sure that you really identify how access provisioning and access terminations are conducted, and you have a very good detailed inventory of that, because a lot of times you might find people who are no longer with your organization have access to your systems. So that's one. Second thing is, let's make sure that you really understand how important logging and auditing are of your systems, and you should really consider that as a prescriptive solution in the future for your risk management plan. And third is, let's not forget that for any major hospital or any significant size clinic, biomedical devices are always given short shrift, and you really have to take care and understand where your biomedical device risks are and how they permeate through the organization. So those are just three concrete steps. Obviously, there's probably 100 things you could talk about, but those are things that keep cropping up in some of the larger hospitals that I work with.
Very good. Well, really excellent, and thank you very much. I guess what I would offer, I'll go to the more strategic perspective for a moment, and that is, John had a great point that you've got to make this a business risk management issue, get as high in the organization as you can, and preferably in the C-suite. I'll echo that, but I'll go on to say that you need to hire competency, and you may have the competency within your organization, and if you do, that's great. The resource that's shown on this page is about a risk analysis buyer's guide. Download it, enjoy it. And the other point I would make is that please help educate your organization that this is indeed a journey. It's about maturing a very, very important business process. I'll end by saying, and we will provide the slide deck. I know there have been a number of questions about that. There are a couple of resources at the end that I'm highlighting here, including a white paper. With that, we'll wrap it up. I'm just going to check one final time. It's 2 minutes before the top of the hour. I have a question